Great. Yeah, I won't. Hillary gave us an introduction to why we're here today. So I guess Hillary, if it's okay, let's turn it over to Caroline.
Great, thank you very much. So, thanks. It's always great to talk with Canadians. That's always a real joy. And so, Hillary and Gustavo and Michael and I have spoken a few times as background to this conversation. And so my understanding is that the foundations on this group are wanting to find some ways individually and possibly collectively that you can, I like Hillary's framing, build the capacity of the system to learn. And so I've given myself a very broad canvas here. I'm going to talk today about some stuff that I have noticed about data and evidence in relation to foundations and nonprofits, which might be interesting and or useful to you. So I'm going to talk to you about some ideas. And I mean, interesting that Hillary talked about the conference in 2018. At that point, some of what I'm going to talk to you about were ideas that I had or we had come across, but now we've done work on them, and I'm going to share some of that work with you. I mean, Michael is kind enough to say that I'm an original thinker. I'm certainly an original stealer of people's ideas, and an original combiner of other people's ideas. And I think that's fine, because if you know anything about the history of science, that's basically what happens. So a lot of the ideas that we have come from somewhere else and have been used somewhere else, notably in medicine, but not always. And now Giving Evidence has done much more work on sharing them and using them, deploying them within this sector, within foundations and philanthropic sector. So I'm going to chop in and out of sharing the screen, but that's what we're going to be talking about. I wanted to kick off by talking to you about 3 programs. I'm going to give you a little tiny sketch of 3 individual programs, and let's see how we go with these. So one is a microcredit program that was run in northeast Thailand. You'll be familiar with microcredit, invented probably 20 years ago, got the Nobel Peace Prize for its inventor, and the Nobel Prize Committee's statement about it said that any solution, it's not the sole solution to poverty, but that any solution to extreme poverty, I think they said, must involve microcredit. And this, I came across an evaluation of a particular program that was run in northeast Thailand, which said that, quote, households who got them, the savings products, were saving more than households that didn't, and spending more time working or on education. So that's the first kind of exhibit A I want to put up. The second one, nearer home, I think this was run in the US, is a mentoring program called Big Brothers and Big Sisters, community-based mentoring program that matches young people aged 6 to 18, predominantly from low-income and single-parent households. It gave them adult volunteer mentors who were also pretty young and mainly college graduates, and they met for 2 to 4 times a month for at least a year, so reasonably intense. Meetings lasted for 3 to 4 hours, and they did activities of their choosing, like studying or cooking or playing sports or whatever. In 2000, by 2008, the point at which I came across this, the study that I came across, it was working with 250,000 young people and nearly 500 agencies worldwide, and the cost of making a match and supporting it was only $1,300. So that's kind of exhibit B. And then the third one is a program which was invented in the States and is run in the UK now, about it was about reducing teenage pregnancy. And so it was run with at-risk teenage girls, and the program is basically that they're given a doll that's quite like a baby, and you have to feed it and look after it and whatever, and it's supposed to demonstrate what a pain in the ass it is looking after a baby the whole time, and therefore act as a kind of deterrent. So I just, and this is a picture taken from that program, and this is a picture of a yacht. So I just wanted to see kind of what your react, and these are the kinds of programs which might come across your desk, right? And sometimes with not much more information about that. And all of them kind of sound reasonable. Some of them have, you know, they have some decent credentials behind them. As I say, they've all been run at reasonable scale. One of them has won the Nobel Prize. One of them turns out to work quite well. Two of them don't have any effect. One of them has no effect, and one of them has a really negative effect. Okay. We don't have time to do a little quiz because I have too much else that I want to talk to you about. But it would be kind of interesting to just do. I want you just kind of think about which one you think is likely to be the one that succeeds. And the point is that it's really hard to tell. And actually, that unless we have proper, rigorous evidence, we just can't tell which programs work. And so like I said, one of them makes the problem much worse, and it is pretty easy, as you know. The claim with nonprofits programs is they're all social interventions pretty much, and the claim is that this thing is sufficiently potent that it can alter the life of an individual or of a community or even of a whole system. And with something that is that potent, it's at least got to be conceivable that the potency might work the other way, and that it might have the opposite effect to what we are hoping that it does. So I just want you to, the point to kind of make at the beginning, and if you were there at the talk that Hilary referred to, I talked about this then, it's really easy to, in philanthropy, to make massive mistakes. Like I have heard trustees of foundations say, oh, it's great in philanthropy because you can never make a mistake. And this is completely untrue. You absolutely can make a mistake. And not just that like people hate you or you, whatever, you have some process that's horrible, but that you make a problem actually worse. One of these programs, you know, makes people's lives, many lives, much worse off than they were before. And so it always seems to me that in philanthropy, as an activist or as a donor or as an advisor, we should always be super alive to the possibility that, you know, we can make massive mistakes by enabling some program which either achieves nothing, in which case, like, you might as well have spent your money just on a yacht, or where you either it achieves nothing or it makes the problem worse. And what seems to me particularly egregious is that if it was possible for us to have known beforehand that this thing would make the problem worse, like if you sort of accidentally make it worse, that's kind of one thing, but you know, if it was already known and if only we had looked in the right place, then we would have known that this thing would make it worse. That always seems to me particularly dreadful. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is really how we avoid that, how we avoid avoidably making something worse or avoidably wasting our money and spending it on a yacht. This was a yacht that sank not so long ago, just by way of kind of illustration. So some of the things that we need to know, I'm having a hard time moving my slides on this, may gather. Okay, so this all sounds really like motherhood and apple pie, but people don't do it. So I'm going to talk through this. So some of the things that we need, what do we need to know when we are designing a funding program or we're looking to solve a problem, some kind of socioeconomic program? Well, we need to know answers to all of these questions. We need to know where a problem is, and why that problem is, and where it arises. That is, we need to have a decent needs assessment, and you'll be aware that quite often proposals come along without a needs assessment. They just say, we're going to do some mentoring, right, without having really established, or organizations, what Esther and Abhijit call supply wallers. They sometimes come along and say, we are going to, you know, send a cow, whatever, without having really established that what the problem is that this is going to solve. We need to understand who else is doing what about it. We need to understand if the problem is really there in this particular context. So just because, you know, there might be a problem with, well, a good example is with girls' participation and achievement in schools, right? That is a problem in many countries. We did some work for some Dutch donors a few years ago who wanted to address that problem in Indonesia, we looked in Indonesia, it's not a problem in Indonesia. That in Indonesia, girls' participation is the same as boys and in school, and their achievement is better. So whatever the problems are in Indonesia, inequitable participation of girls is not one of them. So that project took, a morning to deal with. We need to understand the local context. We need to understand if the proposed intervention is a good fit within that particular context. So as a colleague of mine says, you don't need an RCT to tell you the effect of opening the clinic for an extra day a week if the boat only goes to the clinic on 2 days a week. We need to know quite a bit about the local context. From my experience of applications, these things are often missing. We also need to know about the views of the intended beneficiaries and whether they think this problem is a problem and whether they think it's a priority problem. And then we also need to know about what works to fix it and whether there's rigorous evidence which suggests that any solution is likely to work in our particular context. Okay, and when I say is likely to, that term is doing a lot of work in this sentence, and that's the whole half-hour talk. We could have a discussion about that right now, right there. But we need to understand, what works to fix it. And so all of these things are really important. I'm going to focus mainly on the what works question, but the reason for banging on about this is because that is not the only thing, right? There's plenty of other. It's no good having some intervention which work, if we know it works somewhere, and then we sort of drop it like Starbucks-like into some context without having established whether it's really needed and suitable there. Okay. So we need, on the what works side, we need decent evaluations to help us understand and to identify what works. And a really crucial thing, I cannot stress this too much about evaluations, is that they have different research methods, and different research methods vary in how accurate they are and how reliable they are. And so I'm saying this also again because as foundations, often what we see are evaluations produced by operational nonprofits, and those often tend to be not terribly high reliability, like not terribly well executed evaluations. And this matters because if you have an unreliable evaluation, it's quite likely to give you literally the wrong answer. So here is a slide, you may have seen this before. This is a reading program in India, which was tested in 5 different ways using 5 different research methods. And we don't need to get into the ins and outs of this, but the right-hand column there shows the impact estimate, the effect size that's estimated using those different research methods. And you can see very simply with your eyes that some of those are positive and some of those are negative, and some of them are really big and some of them are really small, right? Well, this always reminds me of that Dire Straits line that, 2 men say they're Jesus, one of them must be wrong. Like at least, like at the maximum, one of these answers is the correct answer, and at least 4, if not 5 of these answers is the wrong answer. So we need to be super sure that we have a research method which is adequate to answer the question that we have. Okay. I mean, for many types of question, randomized trials are most likely to give a good example, the best answer. There are some instances where you can't do that. I'm just reading a history of smoking, for example. You can't do randomized trial in smoking, and the link between lung cancer and smoking was not proved using randomized trials. But it was proved using other things, which is not listed here actually. But we need the right method to answer the particular research question that we have. And I'm banging on about this, like I say, because often evaluations and research that are produced by operational organizations who are basically specialized in something else tends to give us not terribly reliable answers. So we need good evaluations, not just sort of any old evaluations. And we also need them because of this. I really liked how many of you remember have read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. There's a great line in there about the purpose of the scientific method is to make sure that nature hasn't misled us into thinking that you know something that actually you don't. And it's really easy if you have a program. All three of those programs I said at the beginning sound kind of sensible. They could all produce an evaluation that makes them look all right, which can mislead us into thinking that we know something that actually we don't. And so the purpose of science and scientific evaluations, this is why I spend so much time stealing from medicine, is because of all disciplines in the world, medicine is probably the one that is most advanced in terms of production and use of rigorous knowledge and of deployment and science. So we need to have decent evaluations so that we know things that are true and we haven't been misled. And furthermore, we need to have that evidence and research as an input into our grant decisions. And I just drew this slide because you've probably had this experience too. It seems to me that really often in philanthropy, for some reason, we often make grant decisions and then there's monitoring and evaluation kind of after the grant is made. Okay, now we've got this grantee, now let's do some monitoring and evaluation of it. So it's anterior to the, it's positive, it comes after the decision about whether we're going to fund this thing. Whereas at least as much needs to go into looking at the research and evidence up front to decide, is this need there? What do beneficiaries think? And is the proposed intervention likely to succeed in our context? Indeed, what is the context that we're operating? So it needs to be an input in to the decisions. And this is quite a process change for quite a number of foundations. We are giving evidence. We've done work with some foundations about reorganizing their processes in order to change their standard operating procedures so that they can so that changing people's jobs basically and changing what happens when, to ensure that the right evidence and research gets gathered at the right times. And all of this is about enabling us to find and use the research that already exists, that is, in the words of Isaac Newton, to stand on the shoulders of giants. So part of what I want to talk about now is, well, all right, so like, how do you find the giants? Like, I'm aware that many foundations operate in many sectors, and it can be quite difficult to find the giants in them without, doing your PhD. So I want to share with you a tool which we have been using, which is called an evidence and gap map. Do any of you use those? So an evidence and gap map, you do a systematic search for all the studies of a particular type, and you draw a map of them, and it shows you where there is material and where there isn't. So where there are kind of giants that you can stand on and where there isn't. So we did one, and I'm going to show it to you if I can find it. We have a client, Porticus, you may know them, who fund in, among other things, institutional responses to child abuse. And which came out of clerical abuse scandals. This is abuse in schools, hospitals, residential care, churches, and so on, and what those institutions are doing about it. And they wanted their work to be as evidence-based as possible. And so we were like, okay, where is their evidence? So we did a massive search of all the literature, and then we mapped it. And this is what our evidence and gap map looks like. Can you see this? Yeah. So what you do, so you can map any type of study. Okay. This is a study of what works studies. That's interesting. So what you do here is we looked for, in a what works study, you look for a study that shows the effect of some intervention on some outcome. Okay. And we put them on a grid, and in this grid, the interventions are rows and the outcomes are columns. Okay. And when we find a study that looks at the effect of some intervention on some outcome, we put it in that cell. And if it looks at the effect of some intervention on multiple outcomes, then it goes into multiple cells. Okay. So each of these dots here is a study. So this cell here, can you see my mouse? Yeah, this is one systematic review, which is not a primary study. This is one RCT. Down here, we've got 3 RCTs, so on. So this immediately shows us basically where is there research and where is there not research. And you can just see very quickly with your eyes, I'll put across here, that there's not much research. There's quite a lot of cells which are completely empty. There's quite a few cells which have only 1 study in. But you can see that the most studies here are in this top line, right? They're in the prevention. They're about prevention. And we can see there's hardly any in disclosure. There's actually no primary studies in disclosure. The blue are just studies of studies. There's some on response, and there's actually only 2 studies. Oops, there's actually only 2 studies about treatment, but there's just multiple papers that are written about them. So this says that if you are, it's pretty helpful if you are a funder funding in that area, because it means this is where the giants are, on whose shoulders you can stand. If you click here, you can see this brings up a list of all the studies that are in this area. Here they all are. So this is one as a start. It helps you to find all of the studies, right? And if you want to see all the primary studies about response, here they are. Like there's really not many of them, and you can see they're all the blue dots means that they're all studies of studies, apart from this one. So this immediately helps you to understand where the stuff exists. So this is a really useful piece of infrastructure, and this is a really useful piece of what Hilary was talking about in terms of building the capacity of a system to learn. Like this was created by or for a foundation, but then obviously shared with that sector so that any foundation in that sector can use it. We then made what we call a guidebook, which summarizes this evidence. It summarizes the evidence in each cell, so that, for example, here, and this is the big cell where there's 50 odd studies. And if you click on here, there is a summary of the that we wrote about with some partners on of all these 50 studies. And it shows you like what is the risk of bias of these studies. Can you see this thing I've just brought up now? I can't see you now, but it shows, you know, what basically what are these studies, where were they conducted, and what do they all say? So like here's several giants that we can stand on, and what do we learn from these giants kind of collectively? So this evidence gap, I think, is pretty helpful as a piece of infrastructure to be able to use and understand, you know, what the evidence in a particular sector says. These things vary. So here is one. I'm going to show. Lord, I'm going to try and show you one now. Can you see this, Mike? Just tell me verbally. Can you see this?
Just going off. Yes. Yeah.
So you can see this primary and secondary education thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is a map of primary and secondary education, I think, in low and middle income countries. And again, you can see immediately where the studies are and where they are not. So this is actually a reasonably populated study. But this row here, for example, remedial education, look, there's not much going on here. This is one systematic review, and there's only 2. And you'll be aware that loads of philanthropic money goes into remedial education, especially now, actually, post-COVID. This map predated COVID. Well, this is it, that there's not really very much that we know about that. And so we might want to fund the production of more studies. Now, I pulled this study up. I was with a foundation in South Africa, and they were wanting to start, it was a company in South Africa, and they wanted to have a giving program around education. And they said to me, what should we fund? And I said, I haven't the faintest idea, but let's have a look at this map and let's see what is known about rigorously about education in South Africa. And if you select for South Africa, pretty bad news, right? This is 2 studies, I think, going on here. The sum total is 1 impact evaluation about no fees, and there's 2 here. Okay, so we've got 3 impact evaluations in the whole country. When I had this conversation in 2019, this map was completely empty. And so what this says is, oh my life, that we're on our own. Like we're basically completely in the dark. There's no giants here to be able to stand on. We might be able to do some work pulling in studies from elsewhere, but even if we go back to everywhere and we try to select for sub-Saharan Africa, the whole region, I thought this was kind of amazing. You know, there's it's still, you know, there's quite a lot that we might be able to pull in from from other countries and test, but a lot of these will be the same study, and these are systematic reviews anyway. So if we're trying to look for primary studies, it's going to be hard to do, then it's going to be very difficult for us to pull in research. This is what it looks like for secondary education. Very little known in Sub-Sahara rigorously about secondary education. So what this shows is that the evidence and gap maps can be really useful for identifying where research exists, for just locating it and for finding what it says. As I say, the guidebook that we wrote was really helpful for helping enabling portfolio managers, they're called, or program officers, to understand, well, what does the evidence really say? It also shows where there are gaps, and so things that collectively that we just don't know and nobody knows. And by the way, in these areas, and there's loads of gap maps I could show you, where, including the one for UK homelessness actually, where loads of charities produce loads of evaluations all the time, but they're not rigorous enough to get onto these kinds of maps because the research methods that they're using are not really adequate to answer the questions that they've got. And that's sort of the great tragedy in a way. So I wanted to share those with you. Those might be a really useful tool for you, both individually and potentially collectively, in terms of enabling your sectors of practitioners and also the funders collectively to learn. So I often think about, I don't know if you've read this book, Sapiens. He talks about it's about kind of a massive history of the human race. And one of the things that he talks about as being so consequential, and was really around the time of the Enlightenment, was the discovery of our own ignorance, and then a concerted and systematic attempt to fill in the gaps in our knowledge. That's basically what's brought us forward. And so in philanthropy, I think we often need to do that as well, to kind of realize what we don't know and to not take rubbish evaluations as being some kind of way of helping us. So what do you do if you're in one of these sectors? You're trying to operate in an area where there really isn't rigorous research, either there isn't much or there isn't any at all. It always seems to me that in philanthropy, you have very limited meta strategies, actually, that you can look and see, is there decent evidence about how to achieve the thing that you want to achieve? And if there is, then you can do that. That's just evidence-based giving. That's fantastic. There's some giants and you can stand on their shoulders. Or if there isn't decent evidence about what you can achieve, well, you can either fund the production of that research. So this is evidence-generating giving. Sometimes there are donors who don't want to do evidence-generating giving. They don't want to fund the production of research, in which case I think they have to just kind of go back to the beginning and find some different outcome that they want to achieve. Just change the program so that they can go somewhere else where you can do, where there are some giants. Or you guess and hope. That's it, basically. I think your options are to do evidence-based giving, evidence-generating giving, or you guess and hope. I think that's kind of your lot. And in many of the sectors where you operate, and particularly in this example of child abuse, this is kind of no place for guessing and hoping. So we have to be very serious about funding based on where there is evidence, or generating or funding the production of evidence. And again, this can be done either by foundations individually or potentially collectively within their sectors. There's a kind of mantra within evidence-based medicine, which I really like, which I got from Professor Sir Richard Peto, who ran the Oxford Clinical Trials Unit, was involved in that study ascertaining the link between cancer and smoking. And he talks about ask an important question and answer it reliably. All research should ask an important question and answer it reliably. And the reason that I'm putting this up is because monitoring and evaluation, the kind of stuff that we ask grantees to do and to present us with, is research, and we do well to frame it as research. And it should all ask an important question and answer it reliably. But often it doesn't ask an important question and it doesn't answer it reliably. It just asks, often we ask sort of any old question or lots of questions, and then they get answered rather unreliably. So I talked a bit about the research quality earlier. And often often you'll have come across this, nonprofit organizations whose monitoring and evaluation covers a bazillion questions, covers kind of everything that might be useful. We did some work with a foundation a few years ago, which asked each of its 2,000 grantees, it asked them 40 questions every 6 months, because this data might be useful one day. These were not important questions. This is just, it was like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, they sort of built this machine and it was spewing out all this information and then they couldn't turn it off. The converse is true as well, that if there is not budget to answer a question reliably, or there is not the sample size to answer it reliably, then we should not answer it at all. Because as we looked at earlier, having an unreliable answer might be simply the wrong answer, and that might mislead us, and it might get us to fund something which doesn't work, and which furthermore we could have known doesn't work. So now we come to the question about, okay, what's an important question? Often in sectors, there is a mismatch between what gets researched on the one hand and what our frontline beneficiaries want to have research, what the issues that they think are the priority. And so in medicine, this has been noticed, and there's a discrepancy between what gets researched and what patients / carers / frontline clinicians want researched. And so that overlap is too small. And there has arisen in medicine a system for working with frontline beneficiaries to get them to understand what topics they would like to have, they would prioritize for additional research, and then to generate research into them. And we have borrowed that process. It's a consultative process. We've done it now twice, once around intensive farm animal production, and the other is for setting up a new centre in Oxford, hence the gratuitous picture of Oxford, in case you don't know what Oxford looks like. We did this consultative method, and we prioritized the unanswered questions as a sector to come up with a research agenda for that sector. And in the animal sector, one of the funders is now funding production of loads of evidence into the questions that come up through that process as being important. And I'm really happy to talk about doing that with any of you. Okay, we're coming into the final furlong now. There's also been work within medicine to identify the sources of waste within the research process. And all of these really resonated with me in terms of the research that we ask nonprofits to do. There's 4 basic sources of research waste. One is where the answer won't influence anything much. So that can be where the cost basically doesn't outweigh the benefit. That's where a question is not important. So what's going on here is that we're asking a grantee to spend money evaluating something, and whatever they find isn't going to influence much, because maybe not many people run that kind of program, or not many people are interested in that particular social problem, or maybe they're operating in some context that's really peculiar, so it's very unlikely that research will translate to anywhere else. In those instances, it's probably not worth doing rigorous evaluation there. The second is where the answer is already known. So for instance, on that map I showed you about institutional responses to child abuse, there were, as I said, there were 68 studies on that whole map. 53, I think, of which were in that one cell in the middle at the top, about programs to teach children the difference between good touches and bad touches. While we were doing that synthesis, we found a UK charity which had published a protocol for doing another study of that exact thing. And by the way, all those 50-odd studies point the same way. They're done in loads of countries, and they all show basically the same thing. So the answer to that question is already known. We don't need more research to show that. So we can drop out that type of evaluation. A third type is where the research method is inadequate and it's never going to be able to answer the question properly. Often in nonprofits, this is because the available sample size is too small. So a good example is breakfast clubs in schools. I don't know if you have these, but here there's no point asking an individual breakfast club for an evaluation because they're too small. When our What Works Center in education wanted to understand the effect of breakfast clubs, they had to get, I think it was 137 breakfast clubs into one study in order to get a decent enough sample size. And the last one is that the research never gets published, or it's published but somewhere that's unfindable or with too few details. And this is a problem because the research architecture within our sector is really a problem. So that if people publish their research, but only like in a PDF on their website with no metadata, it's basically undiscoverable. So in terms of infrastructure that Hilary was talking about to enable the sector to learn better, this is a thing that could be really important, is better research architecture that enables us to actually find the stuff that already exists. And some of the ways that that funders in particular can help, both individually and collectively, is about not asking charities or indeed anybody else to produce anything without having established that the question is important and unanswered, and also that they can answer it reliably. So that could be a good filter, which would take out, I think, a lot of monitoring and evaluation. Don't also try not to encourage the production of unreliable research. So I see this quite a lot where it's obvious that the sample size available to a nonprofit is too small, and yet they are asked to do an evaluation of it. Don't encourage charities to do evaluations of themselves, because the incentives there are so obviously skewed. And then encourage proper research. Oh, sorry, that's a coach to myself. Encourage proper research and proper disclosure. For example, disclosure should include what in medicine is called PICO. It should detail what the population is, the intervention details, the comparison group, and the outcome. So this mentoring program reduces mental health incidences by 17% in this type of person relative to having no mentoring, or relative to having some other sort of mentoring, and then publish it in a findable place. And we need to ensure that that research is findable and properly indexed. So I love that quote so much that I gave a talk about it a while ago, and somebody happened to take a picture of me standing in front of that quote. So that is what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to just kind of throw some ideas at you for some of the types of work that we have seen and which funders that we've worked with have found helpful. As I say, some of which you can do individually and some of which you may be able to do collectively. We've worked on almost all aspects of this now with funders and foundations in various places, and I'm happy to talk about any of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. There's a lot there to think about and to talk about. And we'd like to now have a more open conversation. This is a small group. I did